In the early years of the 20th century, organized crime in New York City was run predominantly by the Mafia. As impoverished Italian immigrant communities arrived in America, many found their way to wealth via the paths of robbery and extortion. To start with, it was chaotic and by no means unified, but it provided an albeit risky means for the poor to earn a great deal of money. By the 1920s and 1930s, historical events such as Prohibition and the Great Depression made it even easier for gangsters to exploit their targets, and eventually, an organized criminal empire would be born. As such, in those early years of mafia history in North America, these gangsters faced very little opposition or resistance from outsiders. Powerful and often wealthy criminals, predominantly white men, ran the show, and many who weren't involved in organized crime were struggling to get by. Resistance would eventually come in the form of an unlikely force. Stephanie St. Clair, a woman of African descent who was born in the West Indies, would not only reject the Mafia's interests, but would go on to become an exceedingly wealthy criminal herself. St. Clair's elaborate racketeering schemes and shrewd numbers games ultimately ended with her putting up a fight against the most prominent criminal organization in New York, and she lived to tell the tale. Not only was St. Clair an effective financial criminal, she was also an activist for a black community who continued to face inequality and prejudice in a modernizing United States. How did Stephanie St. Clair resist all odds to emerge as successful as she was? What did her conflict with the Mafia look like, and what happened as a result? In today's video, we will be breaking down the life and times of one of organized crime's most unlikely gangsters, examining her fascinating life from start to finish. Join us as we travel back to the turn of the 20th century to meet Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of the Policy Rackets. It's hard to pin down exactly where and when Stephanie St. Clair was born, but that might be intentional confusion rustled up by St. Clair herself to keep her crimes under wraps. While she cited the city of Fort-de-France, in what is today the French overseas region of Martinique, as her birthplace on her 1924 Declaration of Intention, historians believe she may have been born in Guadeloupe. Historian Shirley Stewart, often trusted to be the most reliable modern voice on St. Clair's life, acknowledges this, citing her birthplace as Le Moule, Guadeloupe, on the 24th of December, 1897. Even more confusingly, some sources imply she may have been born a whole 10 years prior to this, in the December of 1887. She was the only child to a single mother, a woman by the name of Felicienne. St. Clair was of mixed African and French descent and was a fluent speaker of both French and English. Her mother worked extremely hard to provide her with a good education in her Eastern Caribbean hometown, and she was known to be an intelligent, bright girl in her early years and beyond. As her childhood progressed, Stephanie decided that she wanted to leave her home in the Caribbean to pursue a life in the United States of America. At the age of 13, in 1911, St. Clair traveled via steamboat to the ports of New York City. St. Clair herself would describe how, before she settled in America, she would spend time in Marseille, and the historians that cite her birth year as 1887 support this. But Shirley Stewart does not. Reportedly, St. Clair would regale her associates and allies in New York of her years spent in France as a teenager, even if they never actually took place. When she eventually found her way into New York City in 1911, however, she initially found work as a servant, working within the homes of wealthy clients while living in Harlem. Other sources note how when Stephanie reached the age of 12, her mother became gravely ill. Subsequently, she supposedly left school and with her family's savings moved to Montreal, Canada, upon her mother's death. In this version of events, she then came to the United States as part of the 1910 to 1911 Caribbean domestic scheme, which saw domestic servants invited to the United States in large numbers. St. Clair, upon her arrival in New York, found herself quickly embedded in the city's growing African American community. Around the time she settled here, 5 to 6 million Black people would soon travel north to more enlightened parts of the United States, such as New York, from the more conservative southern states. Racial segregation, poor economic conditions, and a lack of employment opportunities plagued locations such as Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, and New York soon found itself as a bustling multicultural hub as a result. Despite the fact that many of these new arrivals to the city had fled the racist Jim Crow laws of the southern states, the city was not without its problems for its Black residents. Black people arriving in New York City continued to face social discrimination, even if the laws did not enforce it as harshly as those in the South. Many Black people were pushed into areas of New York such as Harlem and San Juan Hill, which suffered from impoverished, near slum-like conditions in some instances. Despite the struggle, many of these predominantly Black neighborhoods became cultural centers for art, specifically music, which blossomed in the form of jazz. Racial tensions still occasionally boiled over into violent altercations too, and resident white violence mobs, as well as terrorists from the southern states, continued to make life difficult. Moreover, Black people living in the United States of America did not have the voting rights of those enjoyed by white communities, till the African American communities of New York banded together in the face of their struggles, a togetherness which often saw Stephanie St. Clair at its heart. She became a common face at community events and was a valued and well-respected member of the Harlem community not long after she first arrived. It was through becoming this pillar of the African American community, however, that St. Clair began her first forays into the world of organized crime. As she made many connections and friends in the city, criminals would inevitably be among them, and by the end of the 1910s, she was involved in her first gang, the 40 Thieves, of which St. Clair was the leader. St. Clair's motive into becoming a gangster was, like those of many, financial gain. She set her sights on making as much money as possible, and after trying and testing her methods, she settled on committing scams and coercion with her associates. Reportedly, in the first few months of operation, her gang managed to rake in upwards of $30,000. These early schemes had been working exactly the way she'd hoped they would, and by 1923, she began diving into crime on a much larger scale, using $10,000 earned from her scams to instigate a massive numbers racket. Stephanie St. Clair's next move was to start up one of the biggest rackets in New York City, otherwise known as the numbers game or policy banking. St. Clair drew in betting money from the citizens of New York in their thousands. After placing a betting fee, one of St. Clair's clients would need to correctly guess 3 numbers, which would be generated randomly using one of several systems by one of the gang's associates. Those who had guessed correctly and won the bet would be awarded with their winnings on the following day. But St. Clair was bringing in so much money from the racket that any outgoing sent to winners would not impact her earnings. Running the numbers racket, while illegal, was an excellent move for St. Clair. At the time she established the game, very few banks in New York City were accepting Black customers on account of the social and racial discrimination that had become rife across the city. Entering numbers rackets such as St. Clair's became a key way that Black people could invest money and potentially make more, as jobs were also few and far between. St. Clair worked closely with the successful Black crime boss Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson whilst running the racket. He was experienced in the world of organized crime across New York City, and, seeing the potential the scheme had, St. Clair made Johnson her lieutenant. Together, the pair orchestrated everything, and for the next few years, St. Clair began to dominate the numbers rackets across Harlem and many of the surrounding areas. Not only did the scheme give the Black community of Harlem a chance to invest their money, it also provided a wide range of jobs. St. Clair paid her associates well from the money she was bringing in from the scheme and became very rich off of it herself. The numbers racket worked wonders for St. Clair's image amidst the Black communities of New York City. Much of the money she brought in was invested back into the neighborhoods, and she funded projects for immigrants new to America to learn English. She became a prominent advocate for civil rights and would reportedly often take out full-page newspaper adverts adorned with pictures of herself, protesting white violence and educating the community. She openly protested corruption and prejudice in the policing and legal systems, which were balanced unfairly against the Black community's favor. On one occasion, she would find herself catching the attention of the police with these adverts. She was arrested and made sure to make the trial public to minimize corruption. After serving her 8-month workhouse sentence, she met with the Seabury Commission, a watchdog organization designed to keep tabs on the NYPD's levels of corruption, and informed them that she had successfully bribed several officers throughout the proceedings. Moreover, many of the officers who had been responsible for her arrest and conviction were actually customers of her numbers racket. Supposedly, after the meeting ended, several of New York's police officers were fired. By all accounts, St. Clair was an eye-catching individual too. She enjoyed spending her money on extravagant, elaborate clothing, often adorning herself in flamboyant fur coats and glittering jewelry. The numbers racket was bringing in upwards of $200,000 each year at its height, and she kept several $100,000 over the years in savings, with which she bought several apartments. She stayed in and near Harlem throughout her entire criminal career, living at 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill. Her extravagant public image and benevolent character saw her earn a wide range of nicknames across her career. Queen of the Policy Rackets, Queenie, and Madame St. Clair, to name a few. Amidst the struggles faced by the Black community, St. Clair was using her wealth to make life better. Soon, however, a new threat loomed on the horizon: the Mafia. St. Clair's numbers racket was versatile and could thrive both within and outside of the major historical events of 1920s and 1930s. People were always looking for opportunities to make money in these difficult decades, and while the Mafia were making a killing from bootlegging and loan sharking in this time, they experienced a slight decline in profits afterwards. The Mafia turned their attention to areas of New York City that they could potentially turn into money-making territory, and among their targets was Harlem. Amongst the first of the mob bosses to move into St. Clair's turf and attempt to force her out was Arthur Simon Flegenheimer, otherwise known as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a particularly intense individual who operated in the Bronx. His gang, the Noe Schultz Gang, ran alongside gangster Joey Noe, had historically been running bootlegging operations, bringing beer into New York City amidst prohibition. Schultz was notably violent to those who crossed him, and he garnered a reputation for brutality, even amidst the criminal underworld of New York. On one occasion, he kidnapped Joe Rock, a bootlegger who had refused to work with the gang. Rock soon found himself heavily beaten, hanging by his thumbs from a meat hook in an abandoned warehouse. When Rock still refused to work with Schultz, the gangster reportedly smeared a bandage covered in infected pus over his face. Rock's family paid a staggering $35,000 for his safe return, and Schultz obliged, but the victim soon went permanently blind. Now, this unstable and violent criminal was gunning for St. Clair's turf. Dutch Schultz's first act upon St. Clair's territory was to extort operators of St. Clair's numbers racket for protection money. If any of the operators refused his offers, he would savagely beat or even kill them, sending an abrupt warning to St. Clair that he wasn't a man to be messed with. From the get-go, St. Clair and her closest associates openly opposed Schultz, despite the constant threats of violence. She wasn't about to surrender the empire she had spent so long establishing. Schultz responded by launching a personal vendetta of physical and verbal abuse against St. Clair and her men. He would bribe police officers to arrest her operators, continued the butchering and killing of her men, and would even call her via phone from time to time, just to intimidate her. As the attacks and pressure from the Mafia worsened, St. Clair knew that she could not sit idly by while her work and reputation was destroyed, piece by piece. She opted to face the attacks head-on and hit Schultz where it hurt the most: his businesses. Schultz owned many businesses across New York City, which were often fronted by his legitimate businesses. St. Clair and her men, including Bumpy Johnson, started a full-on assault onto these storefronts, smashing windows, destroying merchandise, and rendering the properties unusable. When she was done, she would anonymously tip off the police as to the whereabouts of Schultz's illegal operations, prompting officers to raid his properties. Just one raid cost Schultz $12 million. In today's money, that's about $190 million. Stephanie knew that at any point Schultz, his men, or another mafia boss could retaliate, possibly end in her life. As insurance for this, and for the endless threats that were being made against her, she decided to use her famous newspaper adverts to send messages out to her communities. These messages would uphold her fearless public image and rally her associates into continuing the fight against the mafia. One advert, printed in a newspaper in the early 1930s, featuring a portrait of a formidable-looking St. Clair, wearing an expensive fur coat and smirking into the camera, read as follows: "To the members of my race, many persons have said they are afraid for me, and that I should be careful. I am not going to be any more careful than I have been. Please have no fear for me. I only ask that you listen to my advice and to do what I have told you. I have no fear of anybody. I respect everybody and shall expect respect from them. Enemies have telephoned almost every night and said they're going to give me a ride and bump me off. When they say such things over my private wire, I just laugh at them, because such things sound silly and simple to me. My enemies are now planning to frame me by saying that I carry a gun on my possession. These, and many more things, they are planning to do, but they will have a hard job to be successful. Because from 3 to 7 days before anything happens, I have a warning of it. In conclusion, I will say that I am going to continue to fight until the members of the race get their just and legal rights." Stephanie St. Clair's feud with the mafia had been taking its toll by the mid-1930s, and she had to be careful to limit the attention she received from the police herself. Schultz's threats were by no means empty ones, and he had the power to attract a great deal of attention onto St. Clair and her men. As a powerful white man, he would have been in a position of advantage amidst the inherently corrupt New York Police Department, and the last thing Stephanie needed was a raid, resulting in a lengthy prison sentence or a massive hit to her finances. In order to minimize the attention that would come her way, she decided to take a slight step back from organized crime towards the middle of the 1930s and passed leadership of her illegal businesses onto Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, her trusted lieutenant. Schultz's motivation was beginning to wane too. St. Clair and her men had put up a tremendous fight in the face of his attacks, and soon, his territory had been taken over by none other than Charles Lucky Luciano, a gangster who had recently been instrumental in the development of the Commission. Luciano was not quite as vicious towards the St. Clair gang as Schultz had been, and worked out a deal with Bumpy Johnson that would benefit them both. Luciano managed to strike a deal where he would take over any territory in Harlem previously conquered by Schultz, and would send a cut of any profits he made in Harlem to the St. Clair gang. If any problems arose, Luciano would need to consult Johnson, and efforts were made to cease the St. Clair mafia violence that had become so prolific under Schultz. Not only were many innocent people being injured or killed, but Luciano had noted that the war was bad for business. It made it nearly impossible to successfully carry out crimes without attracting attention, and it was time to bring it to a close. Johnson, on the other hand, would continue to protect Stephanie St. Clair amidst any future run-ins with the police. Then, on the 23rd of October, 1935, Schultz was removed from the equation for good. The gangster had found himself in hot water with the Mafia Commission after he insisted on killing federal prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, who had been putting the mob under pressure. The commission did not wish to kill Dewey as to not raise suspicion and create public backlash, and so Schultz planned to carry out the murder himself. Fearing that Schultz would be carrying out the attack any day, the commission opted to end his life. That night, the 23rd of October, Schultz had taken a trip to the Palace Chop House restaurant in Newark, alongside his accountant Otto Berman and a series of associates. When Schultz headed to the bathroom, two commission assassins, Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, followed him in. Workman shot him once. The assassins then turned their guns on the other members of Schultz's gang. Despite taking several direct hits, the gangsters retaliated, covering Schultz while he staggered to his feet. Schultz and his gangsters would be taken to hospital that night. Several of them, including Berman, would die from their injuries in the early hours of the next morning. Schultz, meanwhile, held out for a while longer. As he began to shift in and out of lucidity, he was read his last rites, while peritonitis, as a result of the gunshot wound, began to claim his life. As he lay on his deathbed, he was sent a single telegram, signed to his surprise, Madam Queen of Policy. It simply read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." Despite Schultz's brutality and persistence, St. Clair had won, and Schultz died later that day. While Stephanie St. Clair had effectively won her feud with the Mafia and had made a great deal of money for herself, she wasn't about to retire just yet. Her numbers game, managed by Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, was continuing to see great successes even in her absence, and so she had a constant flow of money heading her way. She would use this money to focus fully on a life of political and civil rights activism, and would persistently advocate for reform in New York City. Her newspaper adverts continued, and she would continue to provide support and opportunities for immigrants and disadvantaged peoples in New York City. Soon, however, another twist saw her already dramatic life story take yet another turn. Towards the end of the 1930s, however, she met her husband, Sufi Abdul Hamid, an African-American labor and religious leader. Born Eugene Brown, Hamid was even more extravagant than St. Clair. He converted to Islam in the 1930s and went by the official title, His Holiness Bishop Amiru al-Mu'minin Sufi Abdul Hamid. His press officer would often embellish tales about him to his followers, stating that he was born beneath the shadow of a pyramid in Egypt, and he also dressed flamboyantly. Often, he could be seen sporting a Nazi-style military shirt with a golden cape and a purple turban. His dress sense led him to the nickname Harlem's Hitler. As such, Hamid was reportedly openly anti-Semitic and associated himself with the Christian Front and German-American Bund, two far-right political organizations. He would, however, renounce his anti-Semitic views later in his career. St. Clair's marriage with Hamid was turbulent from the get-go, and the two often fought. Prior to their marriage, Hamid had talked to St. Clair into a contract which, although non-enforceable under United States law, required them to split all of their assets. She had provided him with thousands of dollars, which he continued to spend irresponsibly throughout the next few years. Hamid was reportedly an avid gambler and would waste great deals of the couple's money on the regular. To combat his losses, he would invest in illegitimate, questionable businesses, and St. Clair also claimed that he was having an affair with a woman by the name of Dorothy Matthews. Matthews, who had built a career as a fortune teller under the alias Madame Fufutum, was even accused of poisoning St. Clair. All of this led to a breaking point for St. Clair, and in the January of 1938, Hamid was shot, albeit non-fatally, while on his way to a meeting with his lawyer. St. Clair was charged with the shooting, and a lengthy court case succeeded, which would also see the couple officially divorce. Just 2 weeks after the divorce, Hamid would marry Dorothy Matthews, despite the fact that he vehemently denied the affair during the trial. St. Clair was found guilty of shooting Hamid and was subsequently sentenced in the July of 1938 to serve 10 years imprisonment. She completed her sentence at the maximum security Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York and seems to have done so without incident. Just 1 month after she was incarcerated, however, Hamid died when his private plane ran out of fuel, crashing on Long Island, New York. Reportedly, he had purposefully underfueled his plane before taking off, attempting to convince his followers that he could afford the luxury of a private aircraft on the condition that he kept it low on fuel. Dorothy Matthews claimed to frequently see apparitions of Hamid after his death, in which he told her he would return to Earth after a period of 60 days. Of course, this never happened, and his legacy remains a bizarre and turbulent one. In the early 1940s, Stephanie St. Clair was released from Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, having completed the majority of her prison sentence. From this point onwards, she does not seem to have been involved in criminal activity again and opted to remain fully focused on her activism work. She continued to utilize her newspaper adverts to inform Black citizens of New York on their rights and maintained her position in the community as a pillar of support. She aimed to be as public as possible with her criticism of the New York Police Department, calling out police brutality and the discrimination of Black communities in the city. As she grew older, St. Clair opted for a more secluded life, and, having made hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep her going, she retired to her quiet Harlem apartment. She lived to see the 1965 Voting Rights Act come into legislation in America, which provided Black people across the country with equal voting rights. St. Clair's life came to a quiet and peaceful end in 1969, from natural causes. She was aged either 72 or 82 at the time, depending on the historian you consult. For much of her life's waning years, she lived with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, who kept her company and pursued his hobby as a poet. He had passed away 1 year prior to St. Clair. At the time she died, she was still exceedingly wealthy and remained well loved by her community, but her passing essentially went unreported by the media. While her death may not have made massive waves across the world outside of Harlem at the time, Stephanie St. Clair has gone on to become tremendously influential in popular culture relating to organized crime today. Her likeness has gone on to inspire the creation of both television and film characters, and as such, her character has appeared in the likes of Hoodlum in 1997, The Cotton Club in 1984, and the 2024 Apple TV series Time Bandits. Her life story has gone on to inspire theater productions, most notably 409 Edgecombe Avenue, The House on Sugar Hill by Catherine Butler Jones. In modern times, St. Clair and her story have even found their way into graphic novels, such as 2022's Harlem and 2021's Queenie, Godmother of Harlem, and video games, including 2020's Empire of Sin. Her story is surely one of the most inspirational and intriguing to arise out of the depths of American organized crime. Stephanie St. Clair lived a tumultuous and often incredible life, and was certainly unlike many of the organized crime figures we have previously covered on this channel. Her desire to expand her financial empire was equally as spurred on by the desire for political reform as it was by money, and she ultimately succeeded in her lengthy fight against racial inequality. Across her career, she went head-to-head with competitors, mafia bosses, white terrorists, and law enforcement, and came out the other side with both her health and a tremendous sum of money held high. She was an incredibly intelligent businesswoman who went on to inspire generations of Black activists to join the fight against corruption, all the while maintaining one of the most lucrative criminal operations in New York's history.